I was thinking about one thing, but Paulina, your introduction and then Paulina's comments got me thinking of something else. So I'll just leap to the something else. I immediately was thinking about, of all things, William Gibson's first set of novels from the early '80s, the what's called the Sprawl trilogy, because I keen on the idea of like today, like with all the changes going on. And what's interesting about that trilogy at the end of the first of the novels, which is called Neuromancer, sort of a fully integrated AI is achieved and discovers another AI on a different star system. And the remainder of the trilogy, one of the things that happens is basically um, religions, everybody's mythologies fragment. And as a consequence, then sort of like society sort of spins into almost chaos because, and then, everybody reverts to almost very almost rudimentary religions, mythologies, almost like an emergence of reemergence of almost like a paganism, which is a really interesting element in those novels. In that suddenly, it's just like almost like people's mental landscape just goes kaboom. And I think that's an interesting analogy. And to Paulina's point, religion is interesting because it's institutional, it's formalized, it's at times, at least in my experience, so what I've encountered in religion, which is very specific, maybe I'll come back to that later, very rigorous, like, trying to put together a massive system and in the experiences I've had, with incredible intellectual honesty and aggression. Um, and that's, not matched easily elsewhere in society. And also picking up on Paulina's point about religion endeavoring to explain things, and then science comes along and picks off one part of the puzzle, but in a way has not been anywhere near as successful at extending its reach and building a system that moves into people's ways of living. And when you see the intensity with which religious wars have been fought, and we see that today. I keep always thinking of like the early to mid 17th century of all things, just the phenomenal brutality. You know, uh, they really brought their game to brutality, and it's like, well, why were people so invested in tiny differences in theology? And it was in part because so much of their way of life was entwined in and given meaning and giving substance by the system to which they were pledged. So I find it's a fascinating complex. We'll come back to other things. I was thinking about Emil Durkheim and his studies of different types of societies and communities based on their religion and different patterns. But we'll come back to that later. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you.
I'll start with pick up something that Kirstyn referenced with Alcoholics Anonymous and AA, and the idea of the role, some of the positive role that religions can play in sometimes some of the more trying parts of life. So AA is very interesting because they are very consciously modeled on a religious movement in the 19th century called the Oxford Movement, which was an attempt to sort of rekindle a personal spirituality and sort of an incorporation of faith into life, which in 19th century England was kind of like way out there. So that's one example. I made quick reference to Emil Durkheim, who's sometimes referred to as the sort of the father of sociology. One of his first books was called On Suicide. And it was a study of different countries and the strikingly different rates of suicide that were exhibited. And this is in the 19th century, late 19th century. And he found that for some reason, Catholic countries had a much lower suicide rate than Protestant countries, and this being in Europe. And a couple of reasons. One of the primary reasons was the system that Catholicism brought, the connection to sort of the higher purpose, and in particular, the concept of absolution, that you can basically ask for forgiveness do your penance and have your slate clean, which was a huge psychological, if you actually believed in that connection to sort of a higher plane of reality through the church, the institution of the church, then it had the ability to give people a psychological peace in a time that's was very, very challenging. So if anything, if I were to pick a time in history that exhibits some of the same social pressures that we see today, I would probably pick late 19th century continental Europe. So if you study, say, Freud and some of the cases he was doing, like, wow, people were crazy. Like, or they really, you could see in their stories intense psychological pressures and manifesting, in ways that are very difficult for us to get into. But once you really move into that space, you say, okay, it's different than what we're feeling today, but in the intensity and the fragmentation in people's psyches, not without precedent. So and so there was an example where religion was playing a key role. Obscurely, I'm going to leap to the early 18th century now, and a poem by one of my favorite poets, Alexander Pope. And so I'm just going to, he's got one great conclusion of one of his really big poems. And he goes, "See mystery to mathematics fly. In vain they gaze, turn giddy, rave, and die. Religion, blushing, veils her sacred fires, and unawares morality expires." And so, in part, he's saying, if our science does too good a job at washing away almost like one of the foundations or one of the props on which our belief systems stand, one of the consequences, one of the things that goes out, one of the babies that goes out with the water can be some of the intellectual framework that holds up our sort of social cohesion, our morality. So religion plays a big role. And I will stop with one more, even more obscure reference. In the 80s, the Chinese government created a commission to study basically what did we get wrong? How is it? We were ahead of Europe, way ahead, say 500 years ago. And we kind of fumbled the football and Europe went leaping ahead of us and wound up coming over and conquering us. Like, what's up with that? Their conclusion was unequivocal: Christianity. And he said, why? Christianity, for one, was quite future-oriented versus some of the belief systems in traditional China, which tended to be much more attentive to the past and we'll call it ancestor-focused. And the second was an orientation to nature. And, sometimes we forget, but some of the key people in the history of science, like Isaac Newton, were religious lunatics. In fact, he wrote more about religion than he did about science. And one of the reasons he did things like invent calculus was to study motion, because they saw in studying motion, you caught a glimpse of the divine. So, we think, the religion, our scientific revolution was a revolt against religion. Then you to really get into somebody like Isaac Newton, go, oh, well, maybe not. So this is all very useful at I think one of the themes that's been coming up in their comments is aspects of religion can be problematic, but there's also a lot of merit. I'll stop there. Well, a couple things, and picking up on what Tulip mentioned about festivals. It's sort of an obscure thing. One word that comes to mind is solemn. In fact, solemn, actually, its real meaning is that it is part of the celestial or the sun's cycle. So it's part of a cycle of life, let's say an annual life, whether it's of the spring or the winter or the harvest or whatever it is. And many religions have done a really good job at sort of organizing this. So basically, it's almost like a manifestation of bringing the belief system into sync with the rhythm of life, and almost like helping people, get geared up for the harvest, for example, or Strove Tuesday or Mardi Gras. Let's eat everything before it goes bad because it's in the middle of the winter and that kind of thing. So it's fascinating to see that sort of intense integration. Picking up just quickly on the point that Kirstyn meant, I just finished reading that book called When Religion Harms You, and it just blew my mind. Like it was just I still can't quite get my mind over into a place where a religion would endeavor to implement that kind of control over anybody. Like it's so alien. So again, as I briefly touched on at the beginning, my background, I wound up going to because we moved all the time growing up. Several of the schools we went to were Catholic. So some of my teachers were Jesuits. And then later on, it was Dominican priories, like it was, and they were intense and extraordinarily learned. In fact, you could drop any one of them into any university campus today, and it would be like watching Wayne the Rock Johnson wrestle Pee Wee Herman. It just wouldn't be pretty. Like these guys were that smart and that learned, and also really dedicated to the idea that if you're going to have a religion, to Leon's point, if you're going to have something that's playing that kind of role in people's lives, then it's got work to do. It's got to really think through and be a good religion, a force for good. And I'll just end on I have experience helping people go through addiction. One of the amazing things I found is the only institutions that would really step up to the really multi-year hard work of helping someone come out of a serious addiction are faith-based. Even today, right, all the sort of medical attempts are almost like leaves in the wind, utterly worthless. The ones that sort of stay the course, in my experience, have always been the faith-based one. I go, wow, I did not see that coming, but that's a good thing. Okay, stop. One last thing. Strange, an obscure book reference, a really good book called Inventing the Individual. And what's interesting about it is basically it's one of the things that emerged out of particularly the Christian faith, that basically our concept of an individual distinct from a family. And if we go back to, let's say, the ancient Greeks that George spoke of so lovingly at the beginning of our talk, they really didn't have a concept comparable to what we have today in any way, shape, or form of the individual. That very, very clearly emerged basically in conjunction with the Christian faith. So I will stop there as my radical closing point. So just quickly, our resident Nietzsche scholar George has stepped away. So on his behalf, I will chime in, and we recall that one of the probably Nietzsche's most famous declaration is God is dead, and he continues with, and we have killed him. And really the point, and I think picks up a little bit on what Kirstyn said, like particularly in the Christian world, it sort of built this huge, almost like a Rube Goldberg machine that is of incredible theological complexity, in part because they were creating a place for individuals to sort of, in this sort of Western emerging capitalist sort of world, and at the same time try and keep the festivals, the thinking, the morality, to actually keep a society together. And really Nietzsche was saying, if you take it away, and Leon, as you said, if you take away that sort of that spiritual, that higher plane, if you pluck it away, then it something's going to step in. And Nietzsche's whole point is then you have to do the hard work